Hello and welcome to this webinar in association with Control Risks. In this session, we'll be discussing the cybersecurity considerations and risk management and how private equity managers are ensuring that their firms and portfolios are safeguarded. I'm Talia Masiri, editor of Real Deals, and today I'm joined by Andy Strickland, Senior Investment Director at Palatine, James Owen, Partner, Global Head of Cybersecurity at Control Risks, and Ed McNicholas, Partner at Ropes and Gray.
Thanks very much, Talia, and thanks very much, everyone, for being with us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name's James Owen. I run cybersecurity at Control Risk, the global risk consultancy company, and that includes all parts of our cyber threat intelligence, risk consulting, and cyber response teams across our operations in the Americas, in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and in Asia Pacific. And I'm delighted, as Talia said, I'm joined by two friends and colleagues here, Ed McNicholas. Ed, perhaps over to you just to give a quick introduction.
Sure. Ed McNicholas here. I run data privacy and cybersecurity practice at Ropes and Gray in the US. I'm the co-leader. I have a mirror in London. I work on data breach response and associated litigation and investigation, such as right now representing the CEO of SolarWinds. They had a hacking incident you might have heard about.
Yes, just a little bit in the news, that was. Thanks, Ed. And Andy, perhaps just give a quick overview of yourself, if that's okay.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, first, I should use the 10 minutes to get some books behind me. I feel very uneducated with my background there. But so my name is Andy Strickland. I'm a senior investment director at Palatine Private Equity. We're a low mid-market private equity fund. I guess I joined this panel with two hats. One, looking at it from the private equity investing perspective, some of the thoughts from sitting on boards and portfolio companies. And secondly, one of the portfolio companies I am on the board of is a business called Cyberfort, which is an end-to-end cybersecurity buy and build that we've been working with for the last 3 or 4 years.
Thanks very much, Andy. And just to mention that, as Talia said, she's having a few technical issues, so I'm going to step in and just work through the questions. But I believe there is a chat function here on the webinar, so please do use that if you have questions throughout the course of this webinar. We'd be very happy to address them and make this as interactive as possible. But I think the plan was for me to kick things off just by giving a sense, just very briefly, of the current threat landscape and what we're currently seeing at the moment globally. So really just from my point of view, there clearly is a lot of change. We've seen a lot of change in particular over the last two years. A lot of that change has been supercharged in the cyber threat landscape by huge rates of technology adoption, and in some cases actually very hasty implementation, all pandemic related. That attack surface as a result has become more expansive than ever before, thanks in part to that technology adoption that we've seen, but also just more broadly to trends in digital connectivity, including the urban sprawl, that is the Internet of Things, Industry 4.0, and the arrival of cloud and edge computing. Devices, sensors, networks are all now much more hyper-connected, many operating on shared infrastructure, and emerging technologies such as AI, quantum, 5G are all helping today threat actors to execute more efficient and better targeted attacks, though conversely, they are also, as a result, helping operational teams internally to improve their cyber defenses too. We're seeing disruptive and destructive nation-state attacks. A lot of these are shaped, as ever, by geopolitical rivalries and tensions. Many criminal groups are now effectively operating as cartels, constantly diversifying their tactics, changing their business models, adapting, in some cases shutting up shop and re-emerging under totally different branding when the authorities get too close. We see this as an example with ransomware operators in a fairly big way. The impacts of these attacks are getting bigger and bigger. We also see that with some of the hybrid ransomware attacks that we see, which combine traditional encryption with data leakage. These are increasingly being leveraged as more impactful attacks. as is targeting of internet-connected cyber physical systems, where the impact is not just to the organizations themselves, but also to society at large. Ed, you mentioned solar winds, the disruption of these types of attacks on oil pipelines, software supply chains, hospitals, utility providers, telcos are really quite significant. And I guess just kind of drawing this back to that point on shared infrastructure and making this as relevant to everyone on the call, we're actually seeing the growing use of software as a service and cloud-based financial technologies, and how these are making a lot of these wider trends a lot more relevant to financial advisors and PE firms today than ever before. And I'm sure we'll get onto that shortly. And this is relevant not just at the kind of PE mothership level, but also clearly to the portfolio companies that they invest in, whose profiles and digital footprints make them more vulnerable in different ways. So I guess what I'm saying here is that there are reasons in some ways to feel rather pessimistic about the outlook. We'll hopefully come back to some of the more optimistic drivers that are out there. But there is a big challenge for organizations to align their controls and risk management procedures to the speed and scale of the issues that right now we're seeing in the threat landscape. So I thought, with that said, Ed, it might actually be useful just to hand over to you to give a sense of what we're seeing in the form of kind of broader trends in the legal and regulatory space, if that's all right.
Sure. It's funny. The space here is very cutting edge and changes every day, but some of this debate has been going on for a while. When California did its data breach notification law in 2003, quite a long time ago, there was this debate about, well, is government here to help companies who are victimized by cybersecurity attacks, or are they here to penalize companies who fail to defend their information? And the answer seems to be both. We have across the globe the folks who are stepping out through there's CISA, FBI in the U.S. There are certainly several organizations in Europe that are there to help support victims of cybercrime. And the intelligence communities often step in through law enforcement to provide information about different threat actors, let you know whether you're dealing with a nation state or not. And it's quite cooperative. Information sharing has grown dramatically. At the same time, we have an expansion of regulators who are coming after companies. The Federal Trade Commission, the data protection authorities have been pounding on companies who suffer data breaches for years. Now we have the Securities and Exchange Commission seems to be taking the mantle as most aggressive U.S. regulator, going after public companies and companies that are registered in the financial services space. In terms of aggressive and invasive procedures, it is the data protection authorities across Europe saw that there was all this data breach reporting in the U.S. and they said, well, that's 30 days. No, 72 hours. The Americans have come back and said, fine, we'll do 72 hours, but there's a bill right now before the Senate saying that that's being backed by business. The Chamber of Commerce is asking to please give us 72 hours because the alternative proposal is 24 hours. And there's been this one brinksmanship of how fast can we have to go to the government? And when you're sitting at it, looking at it from a litigation perspective, there are now plaintiffs firms also in the U.S. that are, their whole firm is dedicated to suing companies after data breaches. So we've seen this evolution. I can't, the representative actions in Europe are just they're here and there. We haven't fully exported rather our culture of class actions to you all, and hope we never do. But it is as much as going on in the courts in the U.S. as we see in the executive branch. So there's lots of movement, lots of response. On a very positive note here, that does seem to be that there's going to be a meeting probably next month. It's been announced of Western nations getting together to finally come up with a shared set of norms on cybersecurity. Now we'll see if, how long it takes to go from initial meeting to treaty, but it would be great to get a treaty in cyberspace. We need at least a Geneva Convention. So like, let's not hit hospitals through the pandemic. But I think that's going to be, in the long run, we will solve this. We will get through this. But in the short term, it's just going to get messier for a bit. So.
Yeah, I think there's almost a parallel, isn't there, between the fragmentation that we see in the regulatory space globally with different cyber and technology legislation emerging all over the world, and a fragmentation we see in any kind of coherent coming together of nations globally around a single unified vision for what the internet should be and should look like in the future. Andy, perhaps kind of taking it kind of down a level or two, how do you see the kind of impact of say the pandemic and its emphasis on remote and hybrid working and kind of broader digital transformation having an impact in what you see in your role at Palatine and the work that you do?
Sure. I'm pleased to see we've still got some people on after that heartwarming start. Unfortunately, I think whilst we're talking more maybe global level there, I think at a micro and business level, I think the issues are very, very much there. And whilst an entrepreneur may not be thinking about legislation in the States and how that impacts their business or international cyber warfare, they really are starting to struggle with how to deal with these. And as you touched on at the start, James, the working from home, the hybrid working, it's created all sorts of issues. I think we're all aware that at the start of it was just try and get up and running, keep your business going, do whatever you need to do. And the fact that there wasn't a great deal of security thought put into that was just, you had to get on with it and you had to do it. And I think people are now starting to have to deal with some of those issues. And with the businesses I work with, both the ones we're invested in, but the businesses that they're selling to, that they're all dealing with similar issues here, with lack of resource, lack of understanding about the issues, being miles ahead from a technological understanding of what happens. And that's with no disrespect to any of those businesses. There's lots of very intelligent people in those organizations, but the organizations haven't typically been set up to deal with some of the issues that you guys have just talked to there. So I think there's some real challenges out there, but I think there's definitely a desire to try to solve some of these issues. I kind of think back 10 years when I started sitting on the boards of private equity backed businesses, and you'd have the chairman of a business who's usually a white male of a certain age who would wave his pen around and laugh hilariously about pen testing, and I think the world has moved on from there. But I still think you're working with businesses who've got CFOs trying to deal with cyber policy. Even if you've got CISOs with all the issues they're working with today in terms of getting people back into the offices, it's a real difficult challenge to try and understand and work you through where the spend of you should be putting your pounds in these areas.
Really interesting there, Andy. Thank you. And in terms of kind of that rush to implement more cybersecurity kind of within businesses, was that kind of accelerated by the pandemic? Did you see kind of more emphasis on it since kind of March 2020?
I think the number of attacks and threats have heightened. So I think even we'll probably all see in our own inboxes the number of emails that we're getting through trying to get information from us. So I think it has become a great opportunity for people to take advantage of some of the issues that have come, and they're off the back of that has become business risk. And when it becomes business risk, it becomes investor risk and risk to those investors who are invested in those people as well. So I definitely think it is getting higher up the agenda at board level. Yeah. In terms of understanding how to deal with that, I think there's a gap.
Definitely. And then in terms of moving on now to kind of looking at the deal process in particular. So Andy, we're just sticking with you for a moment. So why would you say cybersecurity due diligence is important? Kind of, does it fall into the realms of tech DD, or should it kind of be its own entity? And is it its own entity as well? What are your thoughts on this?
I think there's a few parts to that question. I think Certainly when we're looking to exit some of the businesses we're invested in, it's definitely going up the list of things people are asking about as what the cyber program has been and what the cyber strategy has been.
Sure.
And I think the majority of businesses are doing some form of cyber due diligence when we're looking to sell our businesses, and certainly when we're looking to invest, we're looking to do cyber diligence. I think the challenge is with that though, and I don't think it really matters the size of your business. When you're looking to invest in a business, you're in a very tight time scale in a competitive process, and you're limited to the amount of work that you can do when you're up against other people at the same time.
Yeah.
So I think everybody's trying to do as much as they can, do as much desktop as they can, but in terms of doing all the work you'd like to do, I think most of the time you're having to do that when you get into the business and working out from there, which creates its own challenges because you don't necessarily have the budget for the things that you would ideally like to do. You don't necessarily have the personnel with the expertise to do it. So in terms of would everybody be liking to do more? Absolutely. Is there opportunity to do as much of that as everybody would like to? I think it's a challenge. Is it becoming more important for people who are looking to invest and see this as a risk area? Absolutely.
Sure, definitely. Great, thanks, Andy. And James, from your perspective, do you agree with Andy? Are you seeing a lot more businesses kind of do the diligence once they've entered into an investment, once they've kind of acquired a company, and what stage should cyber DD be addressed, in your opinion?
Yeah, a lot more now than just 5 years ago. It's changing really quickly. There's a parallel with the ways in which the FCPA and UK Bribery Act shapes the need for integrity due diligence with cyber due diligence and the impact of kind of what Ed was talking about in the regulatory and legal space. But yeah, we are seeing the need for cyber due diligence to provide insights into existing and future cybersecurity challenges, provide insights on past incidents that could affect the value or brand and potential cost of remediation. For a deal team, it will enable them to hopefully achieve more value in the acquisition and inform contractual negotiations. Again, prioritize those remediation actions. But I don't think it's not just pre-deal that we're talking about here. Or kind of investment-driven pre-transaction due diligence. Outside-in kind of due diligence is useful, but the inside-out view is useful as well. But obviously that's more overt, and that requires you to be in the company to assess the internal cybersecurity governance and risk management. And on the portfolio side, what we're finding increasingly is that it's providing a prioritized view of the cybersecurity maturity of not just the company itself, but providing almost like a health check on investments across the portfolio as a whole, where actually the findings of those due diligence exercises can be used to benchmark the risks related to future acquisitions based on thresholds and risk tolerance levels. So, and finally, also, I think on the post-breach side, we're also seeing examples of where the due diligence can be a vital tool to investigate an incident and then ultimately help that organization build back better. So yeah, pre-deal and as early on as possible, of course, but actually there's lots of different ways that it can be used to help inform decision-making and not just on the negotiation side.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm guessing it's obviously a case of having to continually monitor and kind of keep up with cyber security, as opposed to just kind of doing the assessment early on and then not kind of revisiting it.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, a very kind of initial online passive scan would show you, for example, whether you've got stolen login or employee credentials being sold on criminal marketplaces on the deep and dark web. It would show evidence of, to the extent possible, of past breaches, technical vulnerabilities in the IT infrastructure, and a lot of the risk that will be flagged in an initial pre-deal due diligence on the cyber side would be shaped by the sector that the company is operating in, the criticality of kind of third-party relationships that it has, its overall profile and the sensitivity of the work that it does, and fundamentally actually how much sensitive IP it maintains and how much personal information as well. So all these kind of things are potential red flags that could be exploited or exposed depending on the maturity of the infrastructure, and you're better knowing that I would say this, I guess, but you're better knowing that up front than kind of inheriting that and having to kind of pay lots of money to remediate it.
I think one thing I just add to that, I think we probably potentially answered the question from a private equity investor perspective, and clearly private equity investors are accountable to others, and therefore we do our diligence, and we have to try and ensure that we're minimizing risk as much as possible. I think everything we're talking about here is just good business practice. I don't think this is because you're invested in by private equity.
True.
These are real issues in the business, in businesses at the moment that a strategy needs to be formed around. And James, I don't know if we may come on to it later, but I think we may be given the impression here that it's a big, huge problem and it's impossible to fix it. And actually, I would say there's a lot of steps that can be put in place without getting to a full MDR facility that can really de-risk your investment, irrespective of how much capacity in technological expertise you have in your organization, etc.
I think, yeah, exactly. That's, I mean, the main point for me here would be that cyber is just another risk. And it should be seen, from my perspective, very much as a business risk issue that just needs a standard risk management approach. Yes, perhaps a slightly different and tailored approach to kind of carrying out a legal due diligence or an integrity due diligence, but it's just part of an overall approach to risk management that should be kind of included within, rather than treated as something very, very separate and very technical, for example. It's a risk management issue.
Definitely. And I assume kind of you agree. What's your perspective on this, Ed, in terms of kind of why this is important in terms of managing risk here clearly, and what kind of could be some of the legal implications of a cyber breach from your experience?
You know, it is so vital to have companies shift their mindset into seeing this as a business risk to be managed. Some companies are either very, they're 0 or 100 on cyber risk. Either it's nothing, don't worry about it, or they're terrified and paralyzed that they could pay ransomware tomorrow, and neither is the correct approach. It is one risk among many risks of running a business. And having something that is more nuanced, I think when you're looking at diligence, you look at the policies and procedures, but a lot of times smaller companies will grab those out of a form book, 3 days before the private equity auction process begins, and you can tell. I have been in data rooms where actually the terms of use still, and the privacy policy still had insert contact here in the policies. Well, geez, this is not a privacy program, but it's not a cybersecurity program. This is something you just do in there so that someone could check a box during diligence. The box that needs to be looked at is whether or not there's a governance process that actually takes the risk and says, here's the IT component, and having the business people actually speak to the IT people and integrate, understand what risk there is, and come up with good mitigations. It's vital to have there can be class action lawsuits, regulatory actions, actions from other investors, security. In the US, we've really started going down the road of securities fraud litigation. The SEC has been leading with a few actions, and we've seen other folks follow along. Interestingly, I worked on one of the first ones with representing the board of directors of Yahoo after their breach. And the SEC, I think, used that as the first action because they knew that Yahoo was collapsing into Oath and Verizon, and it was ready to sell. And so would accept a settlement just to move ahead and complete the transaction. And I think that they're using that authority, kind of the SEC is expanding their authority into this area. And that, I think, will be a big driver, the security piece of it, and making sure that there's a real governance structure there.
Yeah, definitely making a real business case there and kind of something on the agenda. I know I said we'd come back to questions at the end, but there's one that's perhaps relevant for our conversation right now around kind of diligencing and assessing cyber security. So we've got one that's come through from the audience. So it says, what do you think about security rating tools? Are they useful during a due diligence, even if their rating is limited to publicly observable data? So do any of you have any any thoughts on that?
I can just very quickly. I mean, there is a value. They will scan the perimeter. They'll identify any obvious vulnerabilities, whether your IP is open, for example. But ultimately, they do oversimplify what can be a more complex challenge, and it's also difficult, really, sometimes to take a kind of really good. To really understand what the meaning of the kind of rating is and to translate that to you, and that there's the kind of the rigor and the value of actually a more kind of qualitative based assessment as well, I think is critical. There is a value, I think, for them, but I think they do also oversimplify the problem.
I think it depends. Sorry, I think it depends what time you've got, what are you available to do. Is it better than doing nothing? Absolutely. I guess I look at this from two different angles. I think from when I'm investing in a business, doing something like that and doing it across all of the businesses you're assessing, you start to build up a bit of a score, and it gives you a bit of a benchmark. So it's not foolproof, it's not the absolute answer, but it starts to give you a bit of an impression. And then certainly if you then got the history of you've invested in one of those businesses and what it was like when you got in, it can start to give you a bit of a flavour. And from a Cyberthought perspective, we look at doing things like that to help whole portfolio companies assess the risk, the relative risk across all of their businesses at a high level as a starter for 10, to work out which businesses and maybe you'd want to start your focus on initially. So I think they can be a useful starter for 10, but I agree with James, it wouldn't be the tool that I relied on wholly.
I think we all have a bit of a take them with a grain of salt. My example there is Equifax. Right before the big Equifax breach, several of the services had Equifax rated very highly, and you would have thought they would have, because they had, very secure firewalls. Even though they were ultimately faulted for patch management, they had an automated patch management system. They had a patch management policy and procedure, and they had people who go around and checked each server to make sure the patch deployed on the server. They just missed one server, and that's all it took.
Yeah, no, completely. Okay, great. So I guess it gives a broader view, these rating tools, but perhaps you kind of need that more qualitative approach to actually to get into the details and kind of tailor it to the company itself. And then continuing on around our kind of deals talk, James, how can businesses generally plan and execute incident response and crisis management kind of to minimize the impact of a cyber attack?
How can they implement incident response? Well, I mean, it kind of starts in making sure that you've got the right plans in place. So we spend a lot of time with organizations, help them create plans that will help them when the proverbial hits the fan, or indeed enhance existing plans. But the really critical thing there is that you need to test those plans. You need to actually craft realistic scenarios that you or your portfolio companies might be subject to. That could be a supply chain compromise, an extortive-based attack, an insider threat issue, and actually to bring those to life through as much as possible semi-live simulations, so that you're putting the people who will respond in that moment to test. Everyone knows their roles and responsibilities. That's clear, because it often isn't, and that's practiced. Actually, the good news, even if the attacks themselves manifest themselves in thousands of different ways, is that the actual best practice principles that underpin the identify, contain, eradicate phases of a response to an incident are actually principles that kind of stand the test of time and can be rehearsed. But that rehearsal point is critical, because our response teams are responding daily, if not hourly, to attacks around the world, and you do see the difference between a company that has kind of rehearsed what they will do and what the roles and responsibilities of the different individuals involved in that response, and the result of that is that they do tend to mitigate the impact a bit more on their critical assets. They do often restore and recover more quickly as well. And it's useful, if you look at the ransomware issue, in particular, it's useful just to actually have had that debate internally around, do we or do we not pay, before you actually find yourself faced with a ransom. You know what your company policy is, and actually make sure that it's part of that kind of CMT planning that you're doing well in advance of that event actually happening.
Yeah, definitely. Great, thanks, James. And Andy, from your perspective, kind of, are there any specific procedures that are followed at Palatine? And perhaps there's always this question around, should there be one person responsible for this, and kind of how is it approached within the firm?
Yeah, so I think there aren't many private equity funds that I'm aware of who have designated individuals whose role it is to look after this with all of their portfolio company.
Sure.
I think even the larger private equity funds don't tend to be so large that they would have that level of resource to do that. So I think it tends to be a level of working with the kind of the operations and portfolios teams, and then bringing in external resource to bring in the experts where required. But I think certainly at Palatine, it's an absolute focus of all our investments that we are working with the companies to do a baseline assessment for cyber as early as we can, ideally pre-deal, and certainly as soon as we can post, to then develop a strategy with the business as the business grows under our investment. Sure,
great. And I guess this is a good point to take in the question that's come through from the audience here. So we've got a question around cybersecurity attacks against private equity firms, if any of you have witnessed any. Ed, perhaps I can see you're nodding there. Have you got any thoughts on this and what private equity firms can do to defend against potential attacks?
Yes, yeah, and so private equity has not been immune, and the response there is quite different. Usually you have a rather small number of people. They tend to be great in terms of communicating, lots of super smart people, but then they're thrown into a new challenge. One of the things that we've seen there is that it's important to have a designated leadership, because if you don't designate a leadership, there will be an effort by the leadership of the firm overall to just run the event straight off. And they bring all kinds of varying levels of information to an attack, and that can be quite a challenge. Private equity firms generally do not have the sort of personal data that would trigger kind of mass data breach notification. That's just not their thing. Some have very valuable intellectual property. And I think the real vulnerability in private equity that we've seen exploited again and again is that people email around and send wiring instructions for large wires in connection with deals. Okay. This is a risk that's near and dear to my heart, because it's also a risk you have at law firms. Because we're on the other end of those emails of trying to make sure who's getting the flow of funds in a deal, and it's usually handled in very small teams. But despite the fact that it's handled in small teams of trusted individuals, the fund amounts are sometimes rather large. And so having good procedures around changes in wire instructions, and also multi-factor authentication is so crucial. There are a good number of firms, particularly ones that are smaller, that have valued being nimble and having every possible device connect in so that people can work 24/7, even if they're sitting in Nigeria, because they're looking at a new company and they're on the ground talking to people in Nigeria. They want to be able to work and connect in. Having the ability to say, no, we need to have multi-factor authentication on that, and restricting usage patterns and watching internally. Those I think are the real things that having data loss prevention, intrusion detection, multi-factor. These are things that even small private equity firms can use to significantly reduce their risk.
Yeah, definitely. Great, thanks, Ed. And James, what are your thoughts on kind of this whole talk of kind of how private equity firms can protect themselves from breaches? What would your advice be?
It wouldn't be too different from any other advice we'd give to other organisations. And I take the point that kind of Andy brought up around kind of the size of a PE firm and the amount of resources and investment that it has at its disposal to put into security and risk management, and often that is brought in from the outside where relevant. But we do work for private equity firms where we do see very specific targeting of IP on a very sensitive deal, particularly where there might be something embarrassing, a transaction involving, for example, a Chinese SOE being leaked in the press. We've seen that. We, in the last 6 months, have dealt with one issue related to direct targeting through an insider threat issue of the top 10 executives' tax returns within a PE firm, which were very sensitive, just given the size of those tax returns from a reputational point of view. But just to echo Ed's point, actually a lot of this comes down to wire fraud. So things like business email compromise, payment diversion fraud. These are some of the bigger things that we've seen. So focusing on people, process, technology, understanding what your kind of threat profile is, and actually whether you are digitally connected to any of your portfolio as well, because to one of my earlier points, actually, it doesn't need to be you yourself that is the target of an attack. You can be the victim through an attack on one of your third-party supplier. So being aware of that that's supply chain in quotation marks risk is also important.
Definitely. It's not just the primary business, but it's all that business reaches out to and who they're working with in the portfolio. Okay. And then kind of keen to shift slightly to look at LP investor considerations. So Andy, from your perspective at Palatine, when it comes to LP considerations, is cybersecurity and kind of that sort of risk management an area of focus from them? Are you kind of receiving any questions about your processes and your portfolio's processes?
Yeah, so I think the LPs are very much becoming, this is becoming much higher on their risk ratio. I mean, it's similar themes to everything we've been talking about today. This is gaining much more prominence. People are concerned about it. There's a real risk to value in investments, and if there's risk to value in investments and risk to reputation, then that starts to resonate further. I think in terms of, are people specifically asking us, do we have a cyber response, and asking for detailed work on that? I think it's part of the general risk management overview, and it's testing our procedures and talking through what we do more generally to ensure that the risk mitigation across our portfolio companies. But clearly from our perspective, it's something that can have real consequences to an investment as a whole, and if it has consequences to investment, that has consequences to how you can operate with your investors and whether you'll get investment again. So irrespective of whether investors are asking for it, we as the management companies have got to take this seriously, because it will have a knock-on effect into whether we would get investment in another fund if this is something that we don't take seriously.
Definitely. I guess at the end of the day, it's not kind of LPs pressuring the GPs to actually implement kind of cyber risk processes. It's more kind of from the GPs outwards. It's not
and I think if it's not now, it will only be a matter of time before those specific questions come in the same way. I think we're going to talk about ESG shortly in the same way that ESG has become a much more prominent part of what investors are looking at. I think cyber will become a much more prominent part of that going forward.
Definitely.
And I just to jump on that for 1 second. I think initially there was a concern with private equity firms about, well, if we have a breach and we disclose it, will people think that we're incompetent, we can't manage, or we're not securing our systems? I think in this day and age, people have moved past that, because I think almost everyone in every organization has had some sort of cyber event. We've all personally had credit cards changed out 3 or 4 times, been offered credit monitoring a half dozen times. So I think what people now we've seen this actually, there are some interesting studies on stock drops after cyber risk events, where we see people, consumers, and business counterparties forgive being hit by a cyber attack because people appreciate that happens. What people are very unforgiving about is lack of transparency. And it goes to trust, and that is the core of private equity in terms of investor trust and reputation and trust in the management of money. And so I think Andy's spot on there. It's a reputation thing, but it's not the breach, it's the response to the breach. You earn your trust.
Yeah.
I appreciate we're keen to move on, but just kind of picking up on that previous point of has a private equity company been targeted? Yes, absolutely. Of course they have. All businesses have. I think to Ed's point there, any industry or company that doesn't think they're a target is just turning a blind eye to a really serious issue here. And I think the view that oh no, we haven't been attacked, it can't be us kind of thing, I think that's moved on. I think people realize that they're getting attacked all the time. It's the severity of those attacks, and people don't see it as oh god, you must be a terrible business if you've had an issue. Businesses are having issues all the time. What people have that don't have sympathy for are businesses that haven't put plans in place and measures in place to try and prevent that in the first place. And I think that's where it's moving to now.
Definitely. I guess the transparency is key with all stakeholders, investors, as Ed mentioned, but it's a case of the firm having a strategy in place if a breach were to happen, or to be able to kind of to know how to deal with that. I'm keen to kind of move on, as you said, kind of to discuss ESG, as clearly kind of that's another key area that is of high importance. It's high up on the agenda, and then we will move on to some of the audience questions. But a question to all of you perhaps around ESG, looking at kind of how governance, specifically the governance of ESG, links with cybersecurity management and how it fits into the agenda. So James, perhaps could we come to you first?
Sure. I mean, it does. I mean, cyber is everything. There's no such thing as a cyber risk and a physical risk. The two are inextricably linked. So I always kind of find it, it's not just the G, it cuts across the S and the E as well. But on the G, it probably is more prominent because it's ultimately about how issues should be managed and how they should be escalated, measured on, and reported on within an organization, and often that falls to the role of a CISO or a CIO, but it cuts to the core of kind of how cyber risk should be managed and effectively reported on. But I used to work in India, and I've seen the impact of how kind of technology solutions can support local economies, can support kind of financial inclusion efforts, access to public services, a lot of the kind of risk assessment and kind of broader ESG work that we do in Africa. It can play a role in the S as well. And likewise, if you look at some of the biggest kind of polluters globally right now, they are some of the big tech companies in terms of the amount of power they take to keep the lights on in those big warehouses. So yes, it's a bit of everything, but probably more G.
Yeah, no, good point. It does really kind of come into that S and G there as well. Andy, what are your views on this?
Yeah, I think it's I think it would be blinkered to just think about it as the G. Okay. I think I go back to that analogy from earlier with the gentleman of a certain age waving a pen about talking about a pen test as a kind of audit thing that needed to be done just to tick a box from a board perspective. It's way broader than that these days. Sure. I think companies need to be looking after their employees. It's not just about companies being attacked, it's about employees who are working for those companies being attacked. That's important. The whole supply chain management piece is incredibly important. So understanding where cyber fits in across that whole piece is the responsibility of the company and the community, and clearly governance is a key part of that. So I agree with James. I think it touches all elements of ESG.
Yeah, perfect. Great. And Ed, what are your thoughts on this, just to conclude?
Sure. My sense is that we are at the really the dawning of governance and cybersecurity. What we need first is to have a common language, so that if you've got someone who's sitting on 10 different boards, that they could look across and say, I know this company has better cyber than that company. Sure. Right now, if you look at accounting, they know for sure. They look at the profit and loss and the assets and liabilities, and they can figure out who's making more money and what are the growth trends and liquidity and all those sorts of things, because there are specific rules about how that is reported. Mm-hmm. We need specific rules on how cyber is reported. So we have to get beyond this idea that all cybersecurity systems are bespoke, and the internal domain of a few guys who run IT, and for them to even talk about it would be a violation of security. We need to have transparent reporting up to senior leadership and senior leadership interest in, and that is governance, so that we actually have governance of cybersecurity and governance of cyber risk.
Definitely.
We're getting there. We're making progress, but we have ways to go still.
Definitely. As you say, kind of, I guess the next step perhaps, and hopefully will be some sort of standardization around that, and some kind of general reporting that can be followed across the board. But a while to go, it seems. Perfect. Okay, great. So there has been a handful of questions that have come through. Just scrolling through here, I think a general question that's coming through is around SMEs and what are the options for SMEs looking to make that first step and introduce some sort of cyber protection into their businesses. Andy, could I come to you first in terms of what you're encouraging your portfolio companies, perhaps? How do you work with cyber, with SMEs, to integrate better protections?
Yeah, so I think it's in terms of working out. I think a lot of people think that they've got to get to 100%, and that's impossible. Businesses are being attacked all the time, as we've said. There's various different levels of sophistication. I think you've got to be cognizant of what you can afford, where you're at in that journey, and looking to consistently improve. And there are things that you can do at every level of that, from staff training through to working with third parties to get monitoring around your networks, around your systems, up into full-scale MDR, which is doing 24/7 monitoring with people doing secure stuff behind that all the way. So I think it depends on your budget. It depends on how you perceive the risk within the organization. But I think everybody has to start somewhere. If you're coming from a very low base, you're not going to get to 100% tomorrow, even if you chuck a load of money at it. So it's about working with people who understand where the business is today, doing that risk assessment, working out where the major gaps are, targeting on the big issues first, and then working your way through that strategy and building it up over time.
Sure. Good point. Thank you. And James, have you got anything to add on this?
No, I thought that was a great answer. I think really for SME in particular, it's about just prioritizing what's most important and not trying to reach for the stars. But I know through brutal experience just how visceral it feels, particularly for a SME when they do get attacked, compared to, say, a big global company where there are hundreds of advisors running around. It's brutal. And so again, some of that planning and risk management can take place in advance, but just focusing on the basics, I would say, just to support what Andy said.
Definitely. And we've got a couple of questions around cyber insurance as well, whether that should be a factor when it comes to risk management. Ed, any thoughts on that at all?
Sure. It kind of tees off the last question, actually, and Andy and James, where you look at your risks out there, and you solve the low-hanging fruit, the quick hits, and you can substantially reduce your risk. But there will be some risk. The risk of the Chinese military hacking into your system. But SME should not worry about that, because if the Chinese military wants to get into their systems, they will. And the thing to do there is to say, okay, can we transfer that risk off to somebody else? Because there's, unlikely the Chinese military is going to wake up one day and say, we're going to go after this particular company. But they might. It's kind of like winning the lottery in reverse. And so that's exactly where insurance can come in. Now, insurance has gone through quite a, cyber insurance has gone through quite a little tumult here with ransomware, because they included payments for ransomware. They have been paying the majority of the ransoms. The thing is that they priced it when ransomware was, you know, $5,000, $10,000 in Bitcoin. Now people are asking for 10, 20, 30, 50 million in Bitcoin.
Sure. Yeah.
And, the insurance companies took a huge bath on that over the last year, and so the criteria for getting insurance is getting harder. Coverages are getting lower, and the premiums are going up.
Sure.
So it is a time to, if you want insurance, to move forward quickly. But I think before you even get insurance, you need to do that basic blocking and tackling, because it is something where, you know, the 90-10 rule is in play. You can put forward that 10% of the effort through people's processes and technology, and that'll get you 90% of the risk, and then cover off the last 10 with the insurance.
Yeah.
Just quickly to add to what Ed said, that the benefit of having an insurance in place is that you do have that outsourced capability that can come and support when needed, whether that's on the crisis management side, on the technical forensic side, on the legal side. So you are importing from the outside an expertise that you don't necessarily have the ability to actually stand up yourself internally.
Sure, that makes sense. Okay, and then just to conclude, if we don't have any other questions from the audience, one around, so perhaps this is one for you, James. Is it valuable to view cybersecurity for an organisation as a linear process, with companies moving from non-resilient / immature to resilient and mature, or should we view this in a different way?
My answer to that would be that you should have a target maturity. So you should have a maturity that you are aiming towards, but that will be a moving target, and it will change over time as the threat changes. You should make sure that your investment in technology and security is proportionate to the threats that you face, and they will be unique to you based on your business, your assets, your geographical and sectoral exposure. So it's a moving target, but it's one that you should be aiming towards, and by all means benchmark against other peers and see where they are and how they're performing, but don't get too distracted by that, because that's a dangerous game to get too obsessed with what everyone else is doing. Focus on your most critical assets and the controls that you need to put in place to meet the threats that you uniquely face. And that, unfortunately, just given the reality of our global kind of digital interconnectivity, will be a continuously moving target or process.
Definitely. Great. Thanks, James. And I guess to conclude here, so clearly cybersecurity is and has become a very important consideration, and something that can impact all sorts of businesses, not just tech businesses, for example. So to conclude, could we perhaps get one key piece of advice for, there's been a lot of interest around SME, so let's look at an SME perhaps in terms of how you would advise them to start their cyber process. So Andy, could we go with you first?
Yeah, I guess it's a similar answer to the one I gave previously. It's assess where you currently are. If you don't have expertise in-house, go and find some externally. Don't think you need to boil the ocean in one go. Work out with your biggest risks and start a program to improve that over a period of time. But see cyber as a risk, as in all the other risks in your business that you probably understand better as an owner because you've grown up with financial risk. Cyber risk is just another risk. There's lots of words around it that will confuse, but bring in experts to help with that if you can't afford to bring them in-house.
Definitely. Great. Thanks, Andy. And Ed?
I think my one-word advice is cloud. If you're a small company, you can shift you can get much better infrastructure if you go to the cloud early on. You'll have 24/7 monitoring of your assets if it's sitting in a good cloud provider, and you can get much better protection than you would if you kept it on-prem. And if I had another word to throw in, I would say MFA. The password is a buggy whip, horrible technology. It should have been dead 20 years ago. Somehow it still is alive. I don't know how, but we should get to multi-factor authentication, have people use it on their email for remote access. that stops a lot of attacks and makes attacks much harder. And it's just not a very people use it on all their personal bank accounts now.
Yeah.
It's just not that complicated technology to implement.
No, definitely, I agree there. And a final word from you, James?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to mention MFA as well. It's an obvious one. You almost want to kind of be more kind of sophisticated than that, but it's about doing the basics and getting them right. And attackers still go after the lowest hanging fruit. But on that point, just to say something slightly different, I think particularly for SMEs, if that's what we're talking about, just making sure that the cyber is seen as a business risk within the organization and isn't siphoned away in the IT department and seen as an IT only issue. It's not. It's potentially an existential issue, particularly for an SME. So they just need to treat it as a mainstream, but prioritize business risk and ensure that the kind of governance of that doesn't just sit in a particular part of the organization, but is owned and reported on effectively and regularly.
Definitely, it's a business-wide case that can affect all, so it shouldn't just be siloed into one area. Perfect. All right, speakers, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. It's been really great speaking with you all, and it seems our audience have been very engaged as well with all of their questions. So thank you all so much for taking part, and thanks for listening.